I've mentioned the one-way hack phenomenon that permeates the Dallas television universe, where Dallas is required viewing if you want to understand Knots Landing episodes, but Knots Landing only gets a passing mention on Dallas. It makes Knots Landing expendable viewing, but that's okay because it learned to succeed under its own power instead of relying on Big Brother to carry it. That being said, if you haven't been watching Dallas or absorbing the Who Shot JR storyline through cultural osmosis, you'd be forgiven for wondering who this strange woman was who appears in this episode. On the other hand, Kristen has the potential to inject some much-needed chaos into the cul-de-sac. Kenny and Ginger are still arguing over the rules of their situation. He wants to get back together and maybe deal with his mistress Sylvie later on. Ginger draws the line that Sylvie gets dumped first and then they can talk.
Well, if you feel like that, then how come you keep seeing me?
I don't know.
Oh, I know this one. It's called cruel optimism, and it's the basis for most modern suffering. You keep holding out hope that maybe someday the other person will learn or change, and it follows a satir change curve where behavior gets worse and worse until it bottoms out and change has to occur or the system implodes. Then things slowly start getting better. Just like Gary at the end of last season. Meanwhile, a totally happening party at a really swinging pad is occurring, and many of the male eyes are on the svelte vixen with lustrous hair. We know her as Kristen Shepard of Dallas. One of her many suitors is Senator Dave Culver, operating under the likely alias of Ed Croft, back in the days when a politician could get away with attending a party with hookers and blow and still keep a low profile. Another in the pack of horny jackals offers her cocaine right as the cops show up to bust up the party. Oh, the irony is that JR threatened to have her framed and arrested, so she agreed to leave town, and now here she is getting arrested, even though she's a victim of circumstance. Call it Kristen's Richard Avery era. The next morning, the ladies of the cul-de-sac are working on their cardio, and they bump into Jason's pediatrician, who develops eyes for Ginger. Later, Richard is terrorizing the neighborhood with his anger. Laura, of course, catches much of his ire, and it will become pretty clear later on that the writers were not on the same page as far as Richard's storyline was concerned. Kristen calls Val and explains that she was arrested. The cops will release her, but only if someone picks her up.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
Val is hesitant, but more than that, she's a doormat, so she agrees. At the studio, Sylvie starts in on Kenny for signing other female acts. She wants to be the only female act on the label, and she's jealous of these other women. This is definitely an ironic punishment episode, because all Kenny ever wanted was a hot wife who was nice to him at home, and to screw around with a number of other beautiful women on the side, and instead, even his side chick is getting possessive. It's right out of the Twilight Zone. In an example of either horrible plotting or fantastic writing, we learn that Richard is still salty over being dropped from Sid's rape case in Hitchhike. Karen confronts him over it, and Richard implies he lost his job because his client fired him in the middle of a high-profile case. Of course, that's not the way it went down at all. In fact, Richard was offered a partnership at his firm, which he turned down to join an even more prestigious firm in Chicago, only to find out that the offer was an entry-level position for significantly less money. So either the writers hadn't figured out quite what to do yet, which was quite common in the episodic TV era, or Richard refuses to admit he's at fault for his situation and is externalizing the blame on Karen and Sid. Kinda depends on how much of a break you want to give to the writers on that one. Abby plays the Bobby Ewing role and asks them to make up, even though nothing has really been resolved between them. The peace is kept. For now. At school, Carl the parent emerges from the danger zone to ask Ginger out. She can't make it on the weekend, but they make dinner plans instead. I'm glad that she could meet him halfway. He's alright. Gary is irritated that Val brought home a stray shepherd, and thankfully they acknowledge that Gary and Kristen barely know each other. They evidently met when Kristen was 10, which is some suspect use of the timeline there. Kristen manipulates Val into letting her stay with the Ewings instead of at the hotel. We get some great banter from Gary and Val as Gary accuses her of falling for a Sue Ellen-style trick, and she accuses him of JR-like suspicion. The funny thing is, Gary's version of Sue Ellen is not at all the Sue Ellen that we see on Dallas, especially around this time. Kenny pops in with a flimsy excuse for being in the neighborhood. He looks like he drove his Plymouth Barracuda over straight from scoping out fresh trim at the mall outside Perry's Pizza. The Ewings introduce Kristen and Kenny and basically get pie-faced out of the way by the sexual tension.
Kristen's my
So you from
sister-in-law's
Dallas too,
sister,
Kristen?
which makes
I just moved
her
out here.
my sister-in-law.
Well, I don't know yet. I haven't been out.
Kenny agrees to stay for dinner. Ginger and Carl enjoy a fireside dinner, having a heart-to-heart as it were. He claims to be so understanding that he never gets his own way. But he does convince her to let him drive her to the airport. This guy is nobody's fool. But he does know what a fool believes. Gary is still suspicious of Kristen, so he calls Bobby to get the skinny. And get this, Bobby says he doesn't know Kristen all that well, only that she briefly worked for JR. Well, that's burying the lead. I know Bobby wasn't in the room for the confession, but surely somebody would have mentioned it to him. Hey, Kristen is the one who shot your brother, that's why she's not around anymore. Now I'm just concerned that Bobby made it all the way to the series reboot without anyone telling him. He's still buying little ads in the newspaper or offering a reward for any information about the shooting of JR 30 years earlier. In retrospect, somebody probably did tell Bobby, but it wasn't about him, so he wasn't paying attention. Val is upset at all this suspicion being bandied about, which makes sense because the Ewings are always suspicious of her motives as well. Kenny offers to bring Kristen into the studio and maybe try to get her a job, openly flirting with her about her clothes.
Val's taking me to the hotel to pick up some things.
Kind of like you and her things.
Thanks, but they don't exactly fit.
That's exactly what I meant.
That gets interrupted when he sees Ginger kissing Carl goodnight. Yeah, the nerve of that hussy. When Kenny was respectfully waiting an appropriate amount of time, putting in the work on himself, and avoiding any immoral liaisons. I mean, he barely even looked at another woman. In the time it took him to turn his head away from Kristen and toward Ginger. Kenny pouts and then speeds off. At the studio, Sylvie meets Kristen and tells Kenny to fire her. Yeah, I don't think I'd take any kind of advice from a grown person who went into the salon and said, "Hey, give me the Eileen Quinn." Kenny shows up at the school to press Ginger on who Carl is. He forbids her from seeing him, which goes about as well as you'd expect. After all, Kenny is still living with Sylvie. Kenny implies that the reason he's not living at home at all is because Ginger kicked him out. He has no real interest in being with other women. Cut to Kristen pouring Kenny a drink, and she advises him to try a new direction. To his credit, Kenny resists her attempts at seduction, instead enlisting her in stalking his ex-wife. How romantic! In reality, Carl is just dropping Ginger off at the airport after some dinner. Or at least that was the plan. Instead, Carl convinces her to wait a little while and go to the jazz club. With Ginger seemingly gone, Kenny and Kristen break into the house for some making out on the couch. Of course, Ginger comes back at just the wrong time and finds Kenny and Kristen having sex.
Oh my God.
Val tries to scold Kristen for coming in between Kenny and Ginger, but Kristen reveals that she's pregnant and just wants to find a man who will love and support her so that she doesn't have to raise the baby alone. She doesn't say who the father is, which is enormously frustrating, but it's understandable from a character standpoint.
I wouldn't do that if I were you, JR. Not unless you want your child born in prison.
Val sympathizes, and this is where my no more Mr. Nice Guy complaint about Mary Crosby's performance as Kristen Shepard reemerges. Kristen and Val break down crying and hold each other, but I'm not sure if Kristen is manipulating her or if she actually is scared and vulnerable. I'd like to believe it's the latter because that would make for a good character arc. It's just hard to see anything she does as not having some kind of ulterior motive. Richard finally reveals that he didn't get fired. He got the partnership he always wanted and threw it back in the firm's face.
Simpson offered me a full partnership.
I don't understand.
Well, I don't think I understand that.
I just don't understand that, child.
Why, I don't understand.
I don't understand. I don't understand.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Laura is upset, especially since they can't survive on her income alone, and Richard isn't exactly in a rush to find a new job. The next morning, Gary crows about being right about Kristen all along. Val tells him to lay off because Kristen is hurt and confused right now. Kristen overhears them arguing about her, and she agrees it's time to leave Knots Landing. But not before she and Gary bond over being black sheep of their respective families. And to wrap things up, Kinney is served with divorce papers while producing Sylvie's next maudlin hit. And we're out. This one is a little frustrating. Not because it's a bad episode, not at all. In fact, Kristen's arrival is a breath of fresh air. That's the problem. There are so many ways they could have gone with this, and so much drama that could have come from her presence in the cul-de-sac. But they didn't go that way. And then they never had the opportunity because this is Kristen's only appearance. She does make the most of being Kristen Shepard, though, acting as the perfect wedge at the perfect time between Kinney and Ginger. Speaking of, the barely functioning couple is at the forefront of this episode, as Sid, Abby, and Karen all but disappear after a single scene. That's fine by me because Kristen's presence precipitates the dissolution of their marriage, which has been coming for a long time and just felt like it was moving at a snail's pace. Besides that, we have Richard finally admitting to St. Laura that he turned down a pretty sweet gig and is now unemployed. That's going to be a pretty big matzo ball hanging over their marriage for the foreseeable future. We'll catch up with Kristen later on Dallas, but for now, just enjoy the energy she brought to this episode.